You know, there's a strange rumor that circulates in certain spiritual corners, whispered like a half-remembered myth, that the universe seems to gravitate toward the ones who are bruised, the ones with fractures, the ones who don't sparkle in the socially approved magazine covers sense. Not because they earn some cosmic medal, not because their suffering gives them moral superiority, but because brokenness creates openings where light can slip through. And nothing grows in a container that refuses to crack. A wound is not an aesthetic flaw. It is a doorway. Most people carry this quiet belief that pain disqualifies them from transcendence. They imagine suffering contaminates them, like spiritual rust that makes them unworthy. They think trauma invalidates their right to insight. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe trauma fractures the shell that polite society keeps sealed. The shell that tells us to stay normal, to stay agreeable, to never admit we're lost. A wound makes it harder to maintain the lie. It forces the truth to leak out. Functional people, the ones who've never had their foundation collapse, are often closed like marbles, smooth, sealed. No entry points. The world feels stable to them, so they never question their assumptions. They don't interrogate their desires. They simply inherit them. Painless people rarely look deeper because they have no reason to abandon the surface. Their lives are like glossy storefronts, convincing, well-lit, but shallow. But the ones who were stretched too far, the ones who were betrayed by someone they trusted, the ones who watched security dissolve overnight, those are the ones who learn the secret architecture of impermanence. They discover that what most call reality is more like cardboard than concrete. They realize the world is stitched together by assumptions, and assumptions can tear. Once you've seen the seams, you never forget they exist, and seams can be peeled open. This is not about romanticizing suffering. Pain is not noble. Trauma is not a trophy. But there is a pattern that repeats itself quietly across cultures and eras. People don't wake up because things are comfortable. They wake up because something breaks. A scar is evidence that you went beyond your limit, and somehow you survived. Ask anyone who endured catastrophic heartbreak. They'll tell you. They didn't just become stronger. They became more real. The mask burned away. Perfection doesn't transform anyone. Perfection is too rigid, like glass that never bends. The universe doesn't need flawless personalities. Flawlessness is brittle. It resists learning because it has too much invested in appearing uncracked. There's nothing to revise in someone who believes they've already graduated from the curriculum of life. Growth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires openings. Openings require fractures, so maybe the universe chooses those who have nothing left to protect. Those who've already watched their identity collapse at least once. Those who no longer need to perform a version of themselves that other people can applaud. Because those are the ones who finally stop pretending. When there is nothing left to defend, there is finally space for something real to enter. Brokenness isn't a defect. It's a portal, a threshold, a gap where the world ends and something unnameable begins. And once you've slipped through that gap, there is no going back to the illusion that solidity was ever the point. Think of it this way. If someone's life has never been ruptured, they tend to treat the world like a fixed object, like a building that's already been inspected and certified. They believe the script they inherited. They trust the official rules. They interact with life as if it's a marketplace, transactional, linear, predictable. There's an unspoken assumption that the world works the way it appears to on the surface. And that assumption becomes their entire psychological habitat. It never occurs to them that the floorboards could give way. But damaged people, they've already fallen through the floor at least once. They've seen what exists behind the wallpaper. They've watched the walls of certainty dissolve like fog when exposed to pain. They know how easily the ground collapses, how quickly security can turn into sand. And this knowledge doesn't make them paranoid. It makes them transparent to themselves. They don't live under the illusion of invincibility anymore. They understand fragility in a way that isn't theoretical. The truth is, suffering forces self-awareness. It interrupts the autopilot. Trauma is like the universe leaning in to say, you cannot keep living unconsciously. You cannot keep repeating the same assumptions. Pain stops the momentum of the persona. It forces the narrative to pause, and that pause becomes the entry point for insight. Without interruption, personality just keeps recycling itself. It loops forever. Pain breaks the loop. When the narrative glitches, illusion becomes visible. It's like a projector stutters, and suddenly you see the beam of light instead of the movie. You become aware of the machinery behind perception. And once you've seen the light behind the film, you can't fully pretend the movie is real anymore. You can sit in the theater, but you can't forget it's a theater. That changes everything. Damaged people become natural mystics, not because they read esoteric books, but because life abducted them from the surface level, without their consent. They didn't choose depth. Depth chose them. And now they can't return. Not convincingly. Not with the same naive belief in appearances. It's not superiority. Superiority is just another ego costume. It's simply that they are no longer hypnotized by the ordinary. Ordinary is too thin. Ordinary is too shallow. Ordinary doesn't fool them anymore. Suffering doesn't automatically create wisdom, but it creates permeability. Pain weakens the armor of the ego. It destabilizes the false center, the persona that pretended to be solid. And that destabilization is the only condition in which deep transformation can occur. Without destabilization, there is no space for revision. There is no room for new architecture. The ego has to crack before awareness can seep in. The universe doesn't choose damaged people because they are broken. It chooses them because they are breakable. Glass that has never cracked cannot refract into stained glass. Clay that has never been wet cannot become a sculpture. Rigid things remain what they are. But something that has softened under pressure can be reshaped into something entirely new. That is the hidden advantage of those who have suffered. People who have suffered can be reshaped, not because they are passive, but because the structure that once held them collapsed. And collapse created space. Space for truth. Space for honesty. Space for transformation that isn't cosmetic, but cellular. They have room where identity used to be, room where old stories used to sit like furniture. And in that room, something new can finally move. There's another layer, one that is rarely spoken aloud because it isn't flattering, and it doesn't fit the heroic arc people prefer to imagine. Damage creates sensitivity, and sensitivity, if it isn't numbed, drowned in substances, or buried under endless distraction, becomes something like an antenna. Not metaphorically, literally. The nervous system recalibrates. The attention becomes refined. You stop relating to the world as content and start relating to it as vibration. Form becomes secondary to frequency. Most people want intuition to be glamorous, a mystical superpower bestowed upon the chosen. But the majority of intuition is actually survival adaptation. When you've been hurt, deeply, unexpectedly, the nervous system becomes porous. You learn to read microsignals the way a sailor reads waves. You don't wait for someone to explain themselves. You don't wait for a situation to clarify. You sense the current before the wave forms. Danger stops being a guess and becomes a felt pattern. And strangely, the same antenna that detects danger can detect authenticity, sincerity, quiet goodness, as well. This is why damaged people notice things earlier. They feel shifts in energy before they become events. They detect subtle dishonesty long before language betrays it. A half-second change in tone, a micro-stutter in someone's breath, a sudden contraction in the atmosphere. None of this is mystical drama. It's micro-perception. And micro-perception only becomes conscious when the system has been forced to navigate pain. Hurt is what sharpened the signal. Spiritual insight doesn't always arrive through cosmic fireworks. Most of the time it arrives through small, quiet noticing, the tiny details that unscarred people ignore because their threshold for sensation is clumsy. A person who has never been wounded often needs huge experiences, extreme highs, extreme lows, just to feel anything. Their instruments are blunt. But someone who has suffered can find meaning in the smallest flicker of awareness. A gesture, a pause, a sentence fragment. Sensitivity is the price of pain, but also the instrument of depth. Pain built a doorway that sensitivity now walks through daily. And in that sensitivity, the universe finds something rare, an instrument it can actually communicate through. Not because this person is better, but because they are permeable. Closed hearts cannot conduct anything. They are fortified fortresses, secure but mute. A pristine heart is like a museum artifact, protected, admired, but useless for creation. An open wound, however, is raw clay. It can be shaped, not because it is weak, but because it still responds. It still moves. It still feels. And the universe sculpting through feeling is not poetic exaggeration. It's the mechanics of transformation. Awareness doesn't sculpt through intellect. It sculpts through sensation. Insight is not a thought. It is a felt shift in perception. Damaged people become conduits not because they asked for it, but because they lost the option of not seeing. They can't return to numbness, and that is the hidden secret behind why they see more. Not because they are spiritual prodigies, but because they can no longer look away from what is real. There's something extraordinary that happens after the nervous system learns that the world can collapse. It's as if the mind stops assuming continuity as a given. The illusion of stability is replaced not with despair, but with accuracy. And this accuracy is strangely liberating. Disillusionment begins to take root. And although that word is usually used as an insult, its literal meaning is one of the most beautiful in the entire human vocabulary. Freedom from illusion. Not disappointment. Not just the absence of an hallucination. The removal of a spell. Once you've lost faith in the ordinary world, the world of status, metrics, and performative success, the psyche becomes available for deeper movement. Like soil that has finally been turned over, you no longer cling to the narrative that society packaged for you. The carrot and stick choreography stops being hypnotic. The scoreboard loses its power, and something inside you relaxes, not because life got easier, but because the lies that were exhausting you finally got exposed. Someone who still believes the mainstream script cannot be shown anything real. Not because they're stupid, but because they're invested. There's no crack in their attention where truth can seep in. They think the stage sets are structural. They think the costumes are actual identities. They treat the background characters as authorities. They are loyal to the wrong story. They cannot imagine another plot because the first plot still feels legitimate to them. But wounded people, the ones who watched their assumptions fail, they have already fallen out of the story. They didn't opt out conceptually. They were thrown out experientially. They tasted collapse. And collapse changes appetite. They no longer crave the counterfeit plot. They don't want shiny illusions anymore. And so when real insight arrives, they don't resist it. They recognize it in the same way someone recognizes their own handwriting, instinctively, without explanation. It doesn't have to be marketed to them. They don't require cosmic fireworks to be convinced. They don't need a guru to give them permission to trust what they already feel. They simply nod, like someone remembering a truth they once knew, but temporarily misplaced. Their knowing is quiet, but unshakable. And that quiet knowing is vastly different from belief. Damaged people are not empty. They are unhooked. They have no psychological debt to the audience anymore. They don't need applause to validate their existence. They don't need approval to continue existing. That is the real difference. The universe is not interested in the shiny and successful. Those people are still trying to maintain their reflection. They can't afford authenticity yet. They still need admiration to breathe. The universe seems to choose those who already discovered that applause is counterfeit currency. That validation is brittle. That external reward is a sedative, not nourishment. Pain creates a vacuum, and vacuums are where new universes form. A mind that has been emptied of false certainty becomes fertile. The soil darkens, and dark soil grows deeper roots. This is not because the universe wants anyone to suffer. The universe does not need your pain. But the people who have already been broken open are the only ones spacious enough to allow fundamental revision. They have room inside them where the old scaffolding fell apart. They have space where the illusion once stood. And in that strange emptiness, something real finally has a place to land. Eventually, the wound stops being a story of what happened and becomes a lens for seeing what is. This is the quiet pivot point most people never talk about, because they imagine healing means erasing the wound. But the deepest healing isn't erasure, it's repurposing. Pain stops being a timeline event. It stops being an identity anchor. It stops being a grievance. Instead, it becomes a perceptual instrument, a way of reading reality with a subtler kind of perception. Pain turns from personal biography into a type of sensitivity that filters existence differently. At a certain stage, pain is no longer personal. It becomes a shift in the very geometry of how perception happens. Instead of using memory to control the present, damaged people begin to use their wound like a cracked lens. And that crack refracts light into unexpected shapes. What once felt like distortion becomes clarity. Through the fracture, they begin to see the subtleties that everyone else filters out. The wound becomes a kind of high-resolution aperture, not a deformity, not a limitation, but a prism. This is where things get subtle. The universe does not choose damaged people because they are martyrs. Martyrdom still revolves around ego. Martyrs need witnesses, recognition, a narrative that glorifies their suffering. The universe does not need martyrs. It needs translators. Translators of the invisible, interpreters of the unsaid, conductors of the silent space beneath words. They're ideas that cannot be taught, only felt, and damaged people are often the only ones attuned enough to feel them. Those who have been broken understand texture more than theory. They trust the felt sense of insight more than the polished rhetoric of gurus. They don't need belief systems. They have scars. And those scars function like braille for intuition. They read reality by fingertip, not by scripture. They recognize truth not because it sounds correct, but because it vibrates correctly. The wound becomes a tuning fork. They don't see life as something to win. They see it as something to perceive. This shift from performance to perception is where the mystery finally begins to speak. Because mystery never speaks to the persona. It speaks through the crack where the persona broke. The universe cannot communicate through someone who is still obsessed with proving something. That person is too busy curating an image to receive anything. They won't risk being wrong. They won't risk appearing foolish. And so their instrument remains sealed. But someone who has already lost face, someone who has already died emotionally at least once, has nothing left to protect. They are not afraid of humiliation anymore, because humiliation already happened. They are not afraid of collapse, because collapse already happened. And so they can say the unsayable. They can feel the unfeelable. They can surrender without calling surrender defeat. They are not superior. They are simply no longer guarded, because the wound was their initiation, their rite of passage, their involuntary initiation right into a different way of existing. And at some point, imperceptibly, the wound stops bleeding, not because the tissue closes like a perfect scar, but because the edges become permeable in a different way. The wound becomes a portal. It turns into a membrane. It becomes a channel rather than a trauma site. They are not healed in the conventional sanitized sense. They are hollowed. And through that hollowness, the unspeakable can pass. Through that hollowness, something larger than the personal mind can move. Through that hollowness, life speaks in a language the unbroken cannot decipher. And that, quietly, invisibly, is why the universe uses them. So here is the final inversion. The universe does not choose damaged people because they are special. It chooses them because they are available. There's something almost embarrassingly simple about that. Availability is the real currency. Not talent, not intelligence, not discipline, not spiritual vocabulary, but availability. And damaged people become available the moment their illusions collapse. When the scaffolding falls, there's space. When the image breaks, there's room. When the persona dissolves, there's an opening. Availability is not earned, it's revealed. They didn't seek enlightenment. Enlightenment infiltrated through the fracture. They didn't aim for transcendence. Transcendence arrived through absence, not through effort, not through mastery, but through the vacancy that appeared when the identity snapped. When the ego is broken, not defeated, not suppressed, but broken in the uncontrollable way life breaks things, a vacuum appears where identity once stood. And nature, including metaphysical nature, has one rule: vacuums get filled. The universe pours itself into the empty spaces. Emptiness invites presence. This is the oldest metaphysical law, but people misunderstand it. They think emptiness means lack. But the emptiness that matters is not deprivation. It's the removal of obstruction. Damaged people are not enlightened by default, but they are the raw material out of which enlightenment can sculpt a form. Because their walls are already gone. The structural rigidity that kept others sealed is already fractured. The universe doesn't have to pry anything open. It just flows into what's already open. Their defenses have failed once, and so they cannot fully rebuild them. They can try, many do, but the cracks never disappear. And those cracks keep them honest. They can't worship superficial success because they tasted the acidic aftertaste of loss. They can't worship status because they saw how fragile it is. They can't worship certainty because the ground collapsed beneath them once. And now they know that the appearance of solidity is temporary, contingent, conditional. And so they become natural mystics, not by ideology, not by intention, but by consequence. Their worldview bends inward because outward illusions proved too unstable. Pain removed the false floor, and in the free fall that followed, they discovered depth. The universe chooses damaged people because they are open. Open in the only way that matters, existentially, not ideologically, not aesthetically, not rhetorically. Existential openness means there is no longer a tight, defended narrative blocking raw experience. And at the end, when the dust settles, these are the ones who can finally hold the world lightly. They are not burdened by it. They don't cling to it. They don't require it to perform meaning. They don't beg it for proof. They don't need to bend reality to match their self-concept. They are not seduced by grandeur, nor chased by fear. They can hold their own existence in their hands with the softness of someone holding a paper lantern. Not with bitterness, not with cynicism, not with superiority, but with quiet tenderness. The kind that arises when someone realizes life was never meant to be a courtroom, but a temporary theater. They don't need the world to be real anymore, because they have become real themselves. The identity that once needed defending is gone, and what remains is not dramatic, but it is authentic. It is simple. It is unforced. It is presence without demand. And in that, the universe recognizes its own reflection.